So we're here with Dr. Esselstyn. Dr. Esselstyn has done years of research on the effects of a plant-based diet on the human body. Um, he's written books. One of my favorite books is Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. And I guess why don't you just explain what your research is and just let people know who you are, I guess.
Well, Jamie, thank you for this opportunity. I think that to me, what is so fascinating about plant-based nutrition for a surgeon uh, is that it broadens the horizon and how we really are able to show people a pathway uh, that will allow them to have the skill set to really eliminate these common chronic killing diseases. My particular interest was in heart disease, primarily because I should give you the background. About the late 1970s and early 80s, I was increasingly disillusioned with the surgery that I was doing for women with breast cancer. I was chairman of our breast cancer task force at the Cleveland Clinic at that time. And for no matter how many women I was doing breast surgery, I was doing absolutely nothing for the next unsuspecting victim. And that led to a bit of global research on my part to try to see if there are other cultures where this disease was less frequently identified. And sure enough, if you look at places like Kenya, for instance, breast cancer was 30 to 40 times less frequent than in the United States. In rural Japan in the 1950s, breast cancer was very infrequently identified. And yet, as soon as the Japanese women would migrate to the United States by the second and third generation, they now had the same rate of breast cancer as their Caucasian counterpart. And even more powerful, perhaps, was cancer of the prostate. When you look at the data from Japan in 1958, how many autopsy-proven deaths were there from cancer of the prostate in the entire nation of Japan? 18. That's probably one of the most mind-boggling public health figures I've ever encountered. By 1978, 20 years later, they were up to 137, which still pales in comparison to the 28,000 who will die this year in this country from prostate cancer. And about this time, I had another little question mark that whether I thought my bones would long be dust before I could really get the answers between cancer and nutrition, although in hindsight, I'm not sure that's correct. But nevertheless, as part of this research at that time, it was apparent that there were multiple cultures where cardiovascular disease, the leading killer of women and men in Western civilization, was virtually non-existent. And so I thought, well, maybe an easier way to do this would be if we could take heart disease and show people that if they would eat to save their heart, they would also save themselves from these common Western cancers of breast, prostate, colon, and pancreatic. So back in 1985, after Ann and I had done plant-based nutrition ourselves for a year, I went to our department of cardiology at the Cleveland Clinic, and I asked for about 24 patients, which was a small number, but it was the most that I could handle and still carry out my surgical responsibilities because I did not retire from surgery until the year 2000. And those 24 patients were, as my late brother-in-law used to say, they were Essie's walking dead. They had failed their first or second bypass. They had failed their first or second angioplasty. They were too sick for these procedures, or they had refused, and there were 5 who were told by their expert cardiologists they wouldn't live out the year. Well, interestingly enough, those those 5 made it beyond 20 years. And it was very exciting. The concern that I had was not being a psychologist. The rock upon which this study was likely to flounder was lack of patient compliance. And therefore, I decided to use the same mantra for these patients that I'd used for my breast cancer patients, that I'd learned years ago from a wonderful surgeon on the West Coast by the name of Burt Dunphy. Burt used to say that patients with cancer are not afraid to suffer, and patients with cancer are not afraid to die. But patients with cancer are afraid of being abandoned by their family or by their physician. So for the first 2 weeks of first 5 years of the study, I saw every patient in my office every 2 weeks. We drew their cholesterol, checked their blood pressure, their weight, and I went over every morsel they ate. At the end of 5 years, I got courageous and stretched it out to every 4 weeks. And then at the end of a decade, 10 years, they were on autopilot. So now I stretched it out to quarterly. And it was really quite exciting to see what happened to these people. And by the end of 12 years, we had some very, very exciting examples of disease reversal, and plus the ability that they had to halt any further progression of their disease. And I guess what we have learned in this, I should share with you that once I retired from surgery, the research was, how will I say it, sort of was taking wings. And I just didn't feel that I ought to leave this alone, because it was just, there was just too much here to learn. And once I retired from surgery, there were still there were calls, because people had heard about what kind of results we'd had with that early small study. And so I have continued with heart disease, and I now work at the Cleveland Clinic Wellness Institute, where I direct the cardiovascular disease prevention and reversal program. And the total number of patients we now have treated is close to 700. And we were rightfully criticized, I think, with our initial study, that it was, although people were excited with the reversal of the disease that could be seen on the angiograms and how the patients did, the question that I think the medical community had was whether or not this was sustainable with a larger group, and would a larger group have similar results. So we now have completed another segment of the study. This is in 200 patients this time. And these 200 patients we have submitted to the peer-reviewed medical literature, and will be forthcoming in publication in July of 2014. Now, it's interesting that, again, compliance is the key. And we found that 89.3, close to 90% of these patients at 3.75, almost 4 years, have adhered to our teaching about plant-based nutrition. And of those who adhere, up to 3.75 years, 99.4% have avoided any further major cardiac events. So I think that this makes it extremely exciting for us, and it really is going to put some pressure, I think, on the medical community to really seriously consider doing what has always been a covenant of trust between the physician and the caregiver since the days of Hippocrates, and that is whenever possible, the physician will share with the patient what is the causation of the illness. And sadly today, in cardiovascular disease, that's not being done. What is going on, and what have we done that makes this possible? I think there are several things to be emphasized here. One is that I think all experts in this disease would agree that where this disease has its inception is when we injure and destroy the life jacket or the guardian of our blood vessels, which happens to be that tiny little single layer thick innermost layer of the artery that has a name, the endothelium. And the endothelium manufactures an absolutely magic molecule of gas that protects us, nitric oxide. And nitric oxide has a number of wonderful functions, 4 of which I'll mention for your audience. First, it keeps all those cellular elements in our bloodstream from getting sticky. It keeps your blood elements flowing like Teflon rather than like Velcro. Number 2, nitric oxide is the strongest vasodilator in the body. When you climb stairs, the arteries to your heart, they widen, they dilate. You climb stairs, the arteries to your legs, they widen, they dilate. That's nitric oxide. Number 3, nitric oxide will prevent the wall of the artery from becoming thickened, stiff, and inflamed. Protects you from getting hypertension, high blood pressure. Number 4, an adequate safe amount of nitric oxide prevents you from ever developing blockages or plaque. And now you say, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? I thought that in Korea, during the war, when we autopsied our casualties, we found that there were 80% of these average age 20-year-old GIs with gross evidence of coronary artery heart disease you could see without a microscope. Not enough for their cardiac event, but there it was. Now that study was then repeated in 1999, roughly 45 years later. This time looking at young women and men between the ages of 17 and 34 who had died of accidents, homicides, and suicides. Now the disease is ubiquitous. Everybody. So it's not surprising if the foundation of the disease is there. When you graduate from high school, you get a diploma, and you get the foundation for heart disease. Is it any surprise that as we continue the same behaviors through our 20s and 30s, that now we start seeing in our 40s, 50s, and 60s, and so on, we see these clinical cardiac events with a disease that has been there since our teenage years. Now, what is it that we're doing, that creates this problem? Well, if you were to think about children who are 5, 6, and 7 years old, obviously you never see a heart attack there. Why? Their nitric oxide levels are sky high. But what knocks it down? Now we know there are certain foods that every time they pass our lips, we injure, we decimate, we compromise the capacity of the endothelial cell to make nitric oxide, the great protector. What are these foods? All right, hold on to your seat. Oil, olive oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil. Oil injures endothelial cells. Oil in a cracker, oil in bread, oil in a salad dressing. Oil injures endothelial cells, as does anything with a mother or a face: meat, fish, fowl, chicken, turkey, and dairy, milk, cream, butter, cheese, ice cream, yogurt. Any of your listeners ever eat any of those foods?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah. Now, and I'm awful fussy about caffeine. Caffeine injures endothelial cells.
Is that the only problem with caffeine? Is that it injures?
Well, that's the one that I'm concerned about. There was a wonderful Italian study they took healthy young subjects, one group having decaf, the other having caffeinated coffee. They did the brachial artery tourniquet test, which determines nitric oxide. And they found that when they switched groups and repeated it, it was always a group having coffee with caffeine that had a compromise to the endothelial function. And for my patients who already have heart disease, I don't like them to have nuts. Nuts can have an awful lot of saturated fat. And how many people do you know who will eat one nut?
None.
If I am ever seen saying you can have 1 or 2 walnuts on your cereal, that's not what people will remember. They would say, Esselstyn says nuts are okay. No. If you have heart disease, I don't want you having any nuts or avocado. So what are you going to eat? You eat all those marvelous whole grains for your cereal, bread, and pasta, and bagels, rolls, and maybe 101 different types of legumes or beans, all those marvelous red, yellow, and green leafy vegetables, and some fruit. Now I want to come back to about the fact that for patients who have heart disease, this gets a little bit tighter. For instance, number one, obviously we don't want them to eat any food at any time. Nothing passes their lips that is going to injure their endothelial cells. I should share with you that the reason that we have the results that we have where others may fail is, I should confess, I'm a bit of a taskmaster. Not as mean as I look, but I have a title in one of the chapters in my book that is entitled Moderation Kills. I mean, if you know that somebody's already had a heart attack, and you know that what the foods are that are going to injure the remaining endothelial cells you have, why would somebody say, well, it was my anniversary, or it was Christmas, or it was New Year's, and I decided to have something with oil, or a piece of chicken or roast beef, and I thought I'd further destroy the few remaining endothelial cells I have? Nonsense. When you stop injuring the endothelial cells, this is not a malignancy. They recover, and they once again begin to try to make the nitric oxide, which is your great protector. And that's why these people will get rid of their chest pain or their angina often within days. But let's accelerate that. Let's suppose that I'm really interested in being greedy for my patients, that I'm a competitor and I want all my patients to succeed. If we will think of the lack of nitric oxide, and if we'll think of the fact that the blockage or plaque in the artery, the blockage or the plaque in the artery is really an oxidative cauldron of inflammation. What do I need for that? I need antioxidants. Now, no, don't go down to the health food store and buy a jug of pills that says antioxidant. It's not going to work. And it can be harmful. So I want you to get your antioxidants from food. What food? Foods that have a high ORAC value. ORAC. Oxygen radical absorptive capacity. What are they? They are the green leafy vegetables. What are they? Bok choy, Swiss chard, kale, collards, collard greens, beet greens, mustard green, turnip greens, snapper cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, cilantro, parsley, spinach, and arugula, and asparagus. That's a few. What do? I want that, one of those, boiled 5.5 to 6 minutes, so it's nice and tender. Then anoint it with several drops of a delicious balsamic vinegar. So you've got something that's absolutely delicious. Then I want you to consume that has been the size of your fist after cooked at breakfast. I want it again mid-morning snack. I want it again with your lunch and sandwich. I want it again mid-afternoon. I want it again at dinner time, and I adore it when you have that evening snack of kale. What are you doing? You are absolutely bathing these plaques that are an absolute cauldron of oxidative inflammation with this powerful antioxidant all day long. And that's why these patients frequently will get rid of their chest pain or their angina within days or several weeks. And that's so empowering because it lets them know that they now, rather than the drugs and the procedures that have failed them, they now are the locus of control to halt this disease that was trying to destroy them. But now we're missing a very, very vital part of this, which is to restore the nitric oxide. If you're beautifully healthy at age 40, your endothelial cells can now only make 50%, right, of the nitric oxide they made at age 25. So does this mean the old carcass is going to let you down? No. There is another avenue through which we can make nitric oxide, through the gastrointestinal tract. How do you do that? The way you do that through the gastrointestinal tract is that if I can persuade you to chew, not smoothies, but chew nitrates, I'm going to give you 6. Kale, Swiss chard, spinach, arugula, beet greens, and beets. When you chew those nitrates, the nitrates in your mouth are going to be further reduced by the facultative anaerobic bacteria that reside in the crypts and grooves of your tongue. They're going to be reduced to nitrites. So now the nitrites in your mouth when you swallow will be further reduced by your gastric acid to nitric oxide, which is what we want. The nitrites in your stomach, which did not get reduced, further downstream will be reintroduced into the circulation. When they circulate back to your salivary gland, they will be concentrated 10 to 20-fold. And now, as you chew additional food, your own saliva, is going to be contributing nitrites to your mouth, which when swallowed, will be further reduced by gastric acid to nitric oxide. Now, so that was the thing on smoothies. Obviously, if you grind it up, swish it down, there's no chance for this thing to be chewed. There's no chance to mix with the facultative anaerobic bacteria to reduce it to nitrates and so forth.
What is your opinion on the paleo diet?
Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate perhaps the genuine rationale between many of these other diets that you will see out there. You'll see Barry Sears and the Zone. Right? You'll see Atkins. You'll see the South Beach Diet. You'll see things like Grain Brain and Wheat Belly and Paleo. And so people are striving. But the interesting thing about all those that I've just mentioned, they're all books. And you can always make a book a bestseller if you'll tell people good things about their bad habits, as my friend John McDougall said. But what none of those books has is really hard clinical data or research on the part of the authors to show that the theory or the theorem holds up. And I think what Dean Ornish did, and what I did before I ever wrote a book, is that we did the research and published it multiple times in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. So we have absolute rock-solid data that this approach can halt disease and it can reverse it, and it's out there for everybody to see in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And we hope to add, as I mentioned earlier, to that this summer in July. And I don't, for a minute, disparage the fact that they perhaps are genuinely trying. But there are times when you'll see that some of these studies are actually supported by the very industries that would benefit, and that always raises questions. I mean, I would love to be supported by the Brussels sprout and broccoli industry, but that that hasn't happened yet. And it's very, very hard to find really any studies where it shows that the consumption of pork and bacon and cream and saturated fats reverse heart disease. I just have never seen that study. But we have got one that shows that it does, and our study is merely sort of following the teachings that absolutely every scientist is open and privileged to. The teaching that there are multiple cultures on this planet who have thrived through culture, heritage, and tradition through plant-based nutrition. And cardiovascular disease there is virtually non-existent. I think that ought to be just sort of a yard mark. And if they're worried about having energy and stamina, they need look no farther than just below the border of the United States in northern Mexico are the Tarahumara Indians, who thrive on what? Beans, corn, and squash, the three sisters. And if you don't think they've got energy, sometimes when they cross the border and they'll enter the Pikes Peak running race and come in first, third, and fifth on sandals.
My question is, do you have any advice for young people going into the health profession?
Well, I think my advice would just simply be to persevere. The fact that the medical schools, I mean, it's tragic. It truly is a tragedy today that the medical schools really have commit something like maybe a single session or thus on nutrition and the entire teaching of the curriculum. And here is probably the most important thing that can possibly involve. And the sad thing is that so many of these professors in medical school are absolutely suffering from the very diseases which they, for which nutrition would be an answer. For instance, isn't it a disgrace to think that the medical schools in their cafeterias are serving the very foods that will guarantee that millions of Americans will perish? The same thing can be said of all of our hospitals. Even if you go into a hospital and you look at the tray on somebody who has just come out of open heart surgery, there'll be bacon and eggs. I mean, it's really challenging. And the United States Department of Agriculture, which is supposed to give a food pyramid every 5 years, that is a food pyramid for the public, or the food plate. And what do you see on the plate? You see those very foods that if the Americans consume them, millions will perish. And who runs the USDA? The government suddenly becomes what? It's saturated with everybody who was an officer in the USDA, formerly was an officer in the food industry. They were the head of the Cattle Association, the Dairy Association, the Pork Board, the Egg Board. I mean, this whole thing is so contaminated. But what will persevere is the scientific data and the truth. I mean, it's although it's disgraceful, with the pace of it, think of how long it took for hospitals to make sure that their employees didn't smoke. I mean, here you have the United States being pulled into debtor's prison faster than anything you can imagine. And one of these is in diseases it's no secret to anybody how deathly disease-causing is the habit of smoking. And yet, just within the last decade or so, finally, all hospitals have made sure that their employees don't smoke. And this was, interestingly enough, it's viewed, and it was a very courageous step, not to hire people into the healing industry who have a loathsome habit that sets a terrible example. And now, the only thing that's even more loathsome or more terrible in terms of our health is the foods that we eat. And have gotten very clever about, in capitalism, about building an entire industry, how to make money out of healing the diseases that we create.
I wanted to get your opinion on if you think that people can survive or people can thrive on primarily fruit and vegetable diet, also known as a fruitarian diet.
You know, I don't think that I've seen any culture that lives on fruit alone. I don't know how I can answer that. Any culture living on fruit, but I know that there are plenty that are plant that we've talked about. But when we talk about plants, we're talking about root vegetables as well as grains, leafy vegetables, and fruit. The whole spectrum combination. Yeah. I don't think I feel like being pinned down saying fruit alone. See, what my friend Colin Campbell, who wrote the China Study, has beautifully defines, I think, the definition of, see, we do not recommend vegetarianism. We do not recommend veganism. I guess we're being a little bit sticklish here. We're talking about recommending whole food, plant-based nutrition. Vegans eat oil. Vegans eat glazed donuts. Vegans eat French fries. I treat vegans for heart disease. That's not what we're after. We're talking about whole food, plant-based nutrition. Yeah. Right. Because as Colin Campbell says, when it's properly nourished, I mean, the body is a beautiful symphony of literally millions and millions and millions of chemical equations going on moment by moment. And that's why when you hear me speak about where is the seismic revolution in health going to come? And as somebody who was a surgeon for 31 years at the Cleveland Clinic, maybe a little hard to hear this, but the seismic revolution in health is never going to come from inventing another pill. The seismic revolution in health will never come from another procedure or another operation. Where the seismic revolution in health will come is when we in the healing profession have the will and the grit and the determination to share with patients what is the lifestyle and nutritional literacy that will empower them as the locus of control to eliminate these common chronic killing diseases.
Well, I thank you for your time.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. Where can more people find out or connect with you and find out more about what you're doing currently?
Well, simply by watching Jamie. I have a book,
yeah.
The Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. I have a website, which is heartattackproof.com. There's a movie that we were involved in called Forks Over Knives. I guess there was a television, CNN business that we were involved with called The Last Heart Attack. And I still work at the Cleveland Clinic Wellness Institute, where I conduct a monthly seminar for patients with heart disease to hopefully give them some ideas, wisdom, and education, which allows them to become the locus of control to stop their disease and begin to reverse it. And yeah, thank you, Jamie. It's been fun. Okay.
Thank you.
Good day. Bye-bye.
So what do you think? The choice is yours. The information's there. The science is there. Heart disease can be prevented and reversed with plant-based nutrition. Prevent and reverse heart disease? Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. So may your bananas always be ripe, and we'll see you soon. Like this video if you like this video. If you want to see more interviews, let me know in the comments below, and subscribe so you can see more of these videos.